Hello and welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon, this is Chewy. Today we're going to look at a game by Robert James Fischer, the great Bobby. Now it's really good to look at Fischer's games because he plays with a real clarity of purpose and a real clarity of ideas, but also in many ways he he was one of the people who pioneered the kind of modern professional approach to chess. And lots of the openings like the Najdorf and the Grunfeld that he played and the ideas he developed for those openings, they're still important today. If you look at Kasparov and Anand, they're hugely influenced by Fischer, and they're playing many of the same openings. I think Anand actually said Fischer invented the moves, we just play them. Now, the likes of Carlsen and Farouge, I think, are going in a slightly different direction. So I think Carlsen, who is clearly, some would say, the best player in history, clearly an amazing chess player, has a different style of chess and is playing different kinds of openings with slightly different ideas. Perhaps you'd say more defensive chess. But, Fischer influenced the game of chess for decades. Anyway, we're going to look at one of his games from 1957, so he was 14 years old at the time. There he is, looking happy at the chessboard, which is where we all want to be, both at the chessboard and happy. And we're going to go through his game against Sherwin in the New Jersey Open. So this was played in 1957. A year later, he would become a Grand Master. And Fischer opens with pawn to e4. He used to say best by test, but certainly that was the opening he almost always used. Sherwin plays c5, the Sicilian defence, which was Fischer's favourite defence, and also Beth's from Queen's Gambit. Fischer plays knight f3, giving the sense that he's going to head for an open Sicilian, which is what he used to play. So an open Sicilian would involve playing the pawn to d4, defended by the knight. So that was a move that Fischer very commonly played. Sherwin plays e6, but Fischer chooses here just to play the pawn to d3. So his comment in the book is, this used to be my favourite. Which is interesting because A, he's saying it's a good move, but B, he's saying it used to be his favourite. So maybe he's moved on a bit. But anyway, the basic idea is that he's playing the King's Indian defence, but it's usually the King's Indian defence is played as black. He's playing it as white. So that means white has an extra tempo. And this is a useful opening to have in your repertoire because you can play it against lots of different black setups. Sherwin brings the knight out, can't argue with that, and then Fischer is developing this King's Bishop by the fianchetto, which is exactly what you'd expect in the King's Indian. The point is that having played pawn to d3, the bishop doesn't have many squares to go to. It could go to e2, but that's simply a defensive square, and it ends up blocking the e-file. And actually, on g2, the bishop will be really useful. It defends the king, it looks right down that diagonal onto the rook. It does lots of interesting things. So this is a kind of modernistic approach to chess, which is to develop the bishop as a fianchetto. Black plays knight f6. Now Fischer comments that another one of his games went pawn d5. Bring the knight through to defend that pawn. You don't want those pawns exchanged off and to swap the queens off. And the king losing its right to castle. That would not be pretty. Bishop d6, so the bishop is coming out onto an active square. White develops his bishop. The knight comes in front of the king. Knight f6, you're a bit worried about putting it there because you're worried about at some stage the pawn coming to e5 and forking the knight and the bishop. So people play, or also I suppose the other problem is if you put the knight on f6, I suppose black can exchange off the can castle. And then maybe exchange off the pawns and put the rook on the open file. So the knight in this historic game of Fischer's came to e7, white castles, black castles, and then Fischer recommends knight h4. Now this isn't a bad move. The engines say it's not the best move, but it's not a bad move. I mean, Fischer's idea is this gives chance for an initiative. But Sherwin didn't play pawn d5. Instead, he played knight f6. Certainly not a bad move. White develops the bishop. Black sensibly develops the bishop on e7, preparing to castle. White castles, black castles. Again, Fischer says d5 is more usual here. Pawn d5 is more usual. Because then, if and when white pushes, the knight can come back to d7 which is quite a nice square for it. It's all a bit like the French defence, isn't it? It has a feeling of the French defence to it. Black castles. White plays knight to d2. Now Fischer makes the point that actually here he could have played pawn e5, attacking the knight, and then the knight jumps to here. White develops a knight. Black wants to get rid of that horrible pawn on e5 because it's sort of cramping black's position. White exchanges, but then puts the rook on the open file. And the engines here do say that white's a bit better. So that pawn e5 move would have been good for white. But Fischer makes another good move, which is knight bd2. Black plays rook b8. Now, Fischer talks about Sherwin sliding this to one side mysteriously with his pinky. And I used to train the Oxfordshire Juniors chess team. And I explained this to them in a training session, and they all, for the rest of the session, were sliding their pieces around with their pinkies and finding it terribly funny. That's the thing about kids, they actually like to have fun, which is something we can all learn from. Anyway, so Sherwin, and I think Fischer's point was Sherwin slid this across with a sort of air of mystery, you know. I mean, I think in many ways, the idea behind this is pretty clear, which is that light square bishop can be picking up, you know, if that long diagonal gets cleared, that light square bishop can be picking up the rook. So the rook just doesn't want to be there. It wants to be maybe on the b file and maybe supporting the advance of the b pawn. So it's not a bad move, although later on we'll show it contributes to a bit of a disaster for black. But on the face of it, not a bad move. Again, here Fischer would recommend d5, and then this sort of position. So I'm just going to play this through quite smoothly. Basically, what's going on here is that we've got a double-edged game where black is attacking on the queen side, white's attacking on the king side. Many people think it's more fun to attack on the king side because the king's there, whereas if you attack on the queen side, maybe you break through and win a pawn or a piece. But actually, the engines here do have black slightly better, but I think many humans would choose the white side of this game. By the way, Fischer's last move, a3, then, is just to impede black's movement on the queen side, and it's a good move. So, rook b8 is what Sherwin actually played. Fischer moves the rook to e1. You see this in the Spanish game. You see this in the King's Indian. This is a sensible move. Sherwin chooses to put the d-pawn on d6 and not on d5, which is, again, quite a sensible mode of development. But Fischer responds by playing pawn c3. His idea here is, I think, well, we'll see, is to move the pawn to d4, where it's defended by the c-pawn and by the knight. And the point then is that white is occupying the centre with pawns. And it's sort of odd because one of the ideas behind the King's Indian is to let the opponent occupy the centre so that you can then fix the centre and destroy it. But actually now, since black hasn't really contested for the centre, white's going to take it. And this is almost a tension between a classical style where you'd occupy the centre and a modernistic style where you let the opponent do so. Black plays the move pawn b6, not a bad move by any means. Fischer was expecting b5, but not a bad move. So Fischer goes pawn d4, as we predicted, just taking the centre for white. Now, black plays queen c7. Now, Fischer makes the comment in his book that this leads to trouble. It does lead to trouble. This is quite a natural move for players of the Sicilian, particularly the Paulsen variation or the Schwenningen or the Najdorf variation, because the queen's often quite safe here, safe from harassment. It can often control the centre. In some lines, not in this line, in some lines it can even give checkmate on h2, backed up by a knight or a rook on the h-file. So this is quite a common move for the queen in these Sicilian lines. And given that Sherwin played pawn e6, it's probable that he was heading for a Paulsen Sicilian or a Schwenningen. So this move will have come quite naturally to him, but as Fischer says, it leads to trouble. Fischer now plays pawn e5, so this is very common in the King's Indian attack, hoping to put this pawn to e5. And in the very beginning, Fischer says that Sherwin committed himself by playing pawn e6, and that's one of the things that made Fischer want to play the King's Indian attack. So, for instance, in the Najdorf, black often plays pawn e5, and if you play pawn e5, you then stop white playing pawn e5. So with the pawn on e6 in French lines or in some of these Sicilian lines, that then allows white to play pawn e5, which creates this cramp. You're pushing away the king's knight, which then might leave h7 undefended, and might allow an attack on the black king side. Actually, we'll see that that's reasonably close to what ends up happening. The knight skips. The dog's completely passed out. Look in the background. He's comatose. The knight skips to d5. Now, modern computers have shown that pawn c4 here for white wins, which is fascinating. I think some wag on one of these chess websites said Fischer could not c4 himself, which is very, very unfair, because Fischer is one of the brilliant players in history, and this is hard to see that pawn c4 here wins. The knight isn't immediately trapped, but it has to jump to b4, and over time, white has an initiative which black can't cope with. Anyway, that's not for this video, but if you're interested in researching it in your spare time, please knock yourselves out. White makes a good move, which is to take here, bishop takes back, and then white can hop his knight to this central square, e4. Sherwin now plays I think what Stockfish would call the second best move. So a pretty good move, pawn to c4. Fischer comments that other moves lose material. So one of the examples he gives is, let's say black takes, white takes the bishop, black takes back, white can push the pawn, making that knight move and then pinning the queen against the rook. So this is quite a hard situation for black, and already he's under real pressure. So he plays pawn c4, which is a decent move. Actually, bishop a6, as discovered by various modern computers, is a better move. It develops the bishop, and it stops white playing pawn c4, which was the source of all this trouble because it covers the c4 square. But that wasn't what happened in the game. What happened in the game was pawn c4, white took, black took, and now Fischer plays this really good move, which is knight g5, which is, it looks like it's just attacking and it's not backed up by much, but actually this causes a world of trouble for black. Black plays knight c to e7, which is a mistake, and now basically white has a good initiative. We would probably say virtually a winning initiative in the hands of a really good player, and it was in the hands of a really good player. So queen c2, attacking the pawn on h7, threatening checkmate. We don't want that in chess. Sherwin puts the knight in the way with knight g6, but Fischer, and this is a classic example of Fischer just pursuing an idea with clarity. Fischer plays pawn h4, and his idea here is to push on from h4 to h5, which threatens the black knight. So either then he loses his knight, or if he moves the knight away, white's able to take with the queen on h7 and give checkmate. So this move it really puts black under pressure, actually, and black's response, knight f6, looks like a really excellent one. I mean, it looks like everything's defended. You know, the knight on f6 is defending the h7 pawn. It all looks fine. But this sets the stage for one of the most wonderful moves in chess, and a move that really opened my eyes to the beauty of chess and the possibilities of chess. So please feel free to pause the video or go and have a sandwich or contemplate the greatness of the universe. But basically, or just watch, white's able to take on h7, and this is effectively a winning move. So that knight looks undefended, and it looks like black can take with either the king or the knight. Now the issue is, if you take with the king, that knight on g6 is now pinned, and so white's able to play bishop f4, skewering the queen against the rook. The queen has to move, and it's a whole rook you lose at the back there. So that doesn't look very good. The alternative is, and this is what Sherwin played, you take with the knight. Now that knight is no longer defending the h5 square, so you can push h5. Sherwin played knight to h4, but the issue now is that black knight is no longer covering f4, so again, the lineup of queen and rook proves to be a real problem for black, and white's able to skewer the queen against the rook. The queen backs off, and again Fischer makes a really good move here. It's tempting, isn't it, to take off that whole rook? I mean, in a way, that's what you'd be tempted to do. The problem with that is that Sherwin takes your bishop, king takes back, and then you got a check there. If you put the pawn in the way, the queen then swipes off that bishop. So actually now, all of a sudden, black is material up. Well, black has got two pieces and white's got a rook and a pawn. But black has a much better position. I mean, that bishop is really useful. The pawns around white's king are a mess. So that's a fiasco. So here, in this position, what white doesn't want to do is take the rook. What white does want to do is take the lovely free knight. And the rook is still attacked. Rook can't escape being taken by a bishop, but it moves to a really smart square, which is b7. And now Fischer decides he doesn't want to take that rook, which is again a really good judgment, positional judgment or tactical judgment, because if you take the rook, black takes back with the bishop, and that bishop is so powerful across those light squares. The pawns around the king are all over the place, and actually, I mean, if black had two moves here, queen d5, queen g2 is checkmate, and clearly black doesn't have two moves, but it's not nice, this. And what do the engines say? The engines say, well, they say white's still ahead a bit, but it's pretty dicey. And so instead of taking the rook, white did the right thing, which is he pushed on with the pawn, trying to open up the cover around black's king. So that pawn's no longer covering the white king, so trying to uncover the cover around black's king. Black plays queen h4. Fischer was critical of this and suggests that black should play g6, and we understand the logic behind that. But actually, black can't stop his king getting pried open, because then there's h5. So actually, the computers believe that this is the best move for black here. They just sort of believe that this is gone now, and that white's going to win, because white's certainly a lot better. White takes the pawn in front of the black king. It looks like black can take off the bishop here on f4. That is not the case, because white will take the rook, turn the pawn into a queen, and then black has to take. So that's all a bit of a mess. So what black should do here is run away with the rook, and then basically hide behind that white pawn. This is a common trick in chess, which is basically to hide behind the opponent's pawn. But Sherwin, I think, here does make a mistake. He just takes the pawn off. And now Fischer's rook enters the game, and now the threats against the black king are just too much, and the threats against the black queen, actually, are just too much to cope with. So the immediate threat here is bishop e5 check, winning the queen. So that's a discovered attack on the queen and check on the king. Black's able to get out of that immediately, but now the rook moves one square back. The king's bishop is attacking that rook on b7. The rook's threatening to come across and give a check and maybe attack the queen. So black plays pawn f5, sort of fighting for an escape route for the king, really. Again, not a bad move, but we're in a point here where there's not much chance of redemption. White attacks the queen. Queen can't go to g6 because it'll get pinned against the king. Well, it could, but that is effectively the end of the game. Queen goes back. Now look at this bishop check. Great square for the bishop. So the positional player will adore this. Great square for the bishop, defended by the pawn. Very hard for black to take that. I mean, the knight would have to somehow get around to take it, take ages. But also just opens up all these attacking chances. I mean, I think Fischer made the point here that he could have played bishop h6 check, king moves, take the rook, take the other rook. So, he could have picked up two exchanges, which again wins. But he wanted the clarity and this sort of simplicity of just saying we're going to go after the king here. So check. The knight goes in the way, but now the queen moves here. The queen's threatening to move to g5 with check. The queen is just also, so you've got the queen and the rook hunting the king, with the black knight just pinned and the king desperately trying to escape. Queen comes to g5, attacking the knight. So the immediate point is that you've got bishop and queen attacking that knight, and you can't let white take there. I mean, it would be almost instant checkmate. Anyway, black's got to move. Queen e7. But now white liquidates the knight. Black can't take back with the king because the bishop's defended. Has to take back with the queen. But then this, just look at this rook check on the 7th rank. I mean, that clearly is a catastrophe. Can't put the queen in the way. It'll just get taken for nothing. King backs off, and then white takes the black queen. Now, if black took the queen here like this, white's just a whole rook up, which is just plenty to win. Black chose to, but by this time it's just going through the motions. I mean, this is over. Black took the rook there. White's able to check on c6. At this point, the game, I think Sherwin resigned at this point. I mean, White has a big material advantage. And look, he's not even used his queen's rook. But if Black even puts the bishop in the way, White's able to take on e6. It's check. The bishop can't take the queen because it's pinned by the other bishop. This is just the end of days. So at this point, after the check, Sherwin resigns. I just think it's a lovely game. It's reasonably clear what's going on. The King's Indian attack is one which I think is worth popping into your repertoire because you can use it as white in all sorts of situations. You can use it by opening f3. You can use it by opening e4. You can even use it by opening g3 or d3. It's a fascinating one. So I thought it was a really nice game, and I think we're going to feature more of Fischer's games in the next few weeks. But in the short term, all that's left now is to give Chewy a little something for waiting so patiently. Last time I recorded this, I knocked everything off the table when I was giving him his food, and so I've had to re-record the whole thing. But I think it was a bit better this time. Just hang on a sec. Oh. Here he is. Look, let's not knock everything off the table. Thank you so much for watching the vid. There's been more coming soon. I hope you all have a lovely day and a lovely Christmas and a lovely New Year.